Time now for Fantasy Forecast Central Radio. Here's Nick Slegel and Brian Dezelske.
Welcome to another edition of Fantasy Forecast Central Radio. My name is Nick Slegel, and I'm joined once again by my co-host Brian Dezelske. Brian, how's it going today, buddy?
It's going really well, Nick. Pretty excited for the 6th episode of our show. We got a couple of great guests on today. Scott King from Football Extra Points will be on later. And we also have Allie Fontana from Fantasy Football Confidential stopping by here in a little while. So I'm pretty excited. I'm a big fan of Allie's. I know you are too. We also will be talking some player breakdown here at some point in the show. And we'll also be touching on some NFL news that happened over the weekend. So how was your weekend? How was your NFL weekend? Did you get any other drafts done?
Oh, you know, as always. I think for me, this might have been my slowest draft weekend. I only did 2, which doesn't sound that much, but you know, for me, that's a downturn. I have 2 today, and someone's trying to talk me into doing a 3rd one, and they're all at the exact same time. So that might be really interesting tonight. Have you started finally getting in all your drafts?
Yeah, man, I can't hardly contain myself. My madness starts tomorrow, and it'll go straight through till next Wednesday. Actually, we'll culminate with my final draft, my big money one of my big money drafts that I have been in league. I've been in for the last 7-8 years now, so I'm pretty stoked, man. Pretty excited.
Yeah, and you know, I always look forward to this time of year because it's, you know, most of the time this is where you do the drafts with all of your friends, whereas the first few months it's mostly internet strangers. But you know, so we have another week of preseason games in the books, and yet again, more freaking injuries making it harder and harder to draft a solid team this year. You know, I think the two biggest ones really to me were Le'Veon Bell going down with, at the time, what we thought was a Liz Frank injury, and you know, luckily it wasn't. And then Jonathan Cooper from Arizona going down with a broken leg. I think out of everybody, all of the injuries this weekend, those 2 probably have the biggest fantasy impact, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, Jonathan Cooper, I want to start off by saying I hate when guys get injured. I just don't like seeing it all. None of us do, but it really saddens me when I see a rookie get injured like this, especially, you know, a top draft pick like Jonathan Cooper was. He was 7th overall. They expected huge things from him down in Arizona. He was going to be one of those road grader interior linemen that was going to, you know, lead the way for Rashard Mendenhall. And it was just a really sad situation to see him. He, you know, broken bones are never a fun thing. And it was really sad to see that. Like you're talking about Le'Veon Bell, he's going to miss the next 6 to 8 weeks, it looks like. Another injury that I think really affects fantasy landscape on the defensive side of the ball is Will Allen down in New Orleans. He's gone for the year. He's, you know, one of their elite, if you want to call him elite pass rushers. He was one of the few guys on that team that can actually get to the quarterback. Now they're going to be, you know, leaning heavily on the other defensive end, Cameron Jordan, not to be confused with Jordan Cameron. Yeah, right. Cameron Jordan is going to be, you know, called upon to, you know, kind of step up and take the next step there as a defensive end. And the less you know, they're not that good of a defense when it comes to, you know anyway, they tend to give up a lot of yards. And if they can't get to the quarterback, it could be a long day for the New Orleans, or, you know, a long season for the New Orleans Saints.
No, I think you're right. They were counting on Will Allen to sort of be the linchpin, the centerpiece of that defense, especially with the scheme switch. And now without him, I really feel like they're going to put little to no pressure on the quarterback on a regular basis, which is going to allow defenses or opposing offenses to just go off on them. And in the end, I think this is probably going to affect Drew Brees and the receivers' fantasy value the most, because we're going to just see them, you know, probably semi-abandon the running game at some point in the game and start airing it out just to keep up or keep the lead. So I think from a fantasy perspective, you know, on IDP perspective, this hurts. Anyone that owned Will Allen was definitely counting on him, and it's going to hurt to not have him on their roster. But on the offensive side of the ball, I think it really only helps Drew Brees and the receivers to a certain extent. I mean, obviously, when Breeze is, trying to keep the team in the game the entire time, we're looking at higher interception numbers probably. But with that comes 5,000-6,000 yards and a ton of TDs too.
Yeah, the Saints will be in shootouts pretty much every week anyway, so this just will reinforce that notion that he'll be throwing it up 50 to 60 times a game.
That's definitely true. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to kick things off with Scott King from Football Extra Points.
Cigar fans, check out fifthdowncigar.com and enter the coupon code PFC to get 10% off your order. Lots of nice high-end cigars. That's fifthdowncigar.com. Enter the code PFC for 10% off your order.
This is Marcus Johnson. This is David Nelson. This is Rob McClain. This is Antonio Gray. This is Antonio Brown. Hi, this is Kyle Rudolph.
On the Pro Football Central Radio Network.
We're here.
And welcome back to Fantasy Forecast Central Radio. We're joined by now by Scott King, owner of Football Extra Points and host of the Football Extra Points radio show. Scott, how's it going?
Great. How are you guys doing tonight?
We're doing awesome. Thanks for coming on, man. So we wanted to look at a couple different things with you today. Obviously, it's draft season. We talked about this just a few minutes ago. We're right in the thick of things now. Everybody's kicking off their drafts. Outside of the heavy hitters in rounds 1 and 2, the names that obviously everybody in your league is targeting, who are some guys of yours that are just favorites that you're looking to target and you feel like other owners should in the later rounds?
Yeah, everybody's in their drafts right now, like you said, and you always want to get that late round guy that makes all the other owners in your league kind of take notice and really get jealous of, hoping to land those late round guys. On the quarterback side of things this year, I'm really high on Carson Palmer. I think, Arizona with Larry Fitzgerald gives them obviously one of the best receivers in the league. And Carson Palmer is a solid quarterback, and they had no play out there in Arizona last year. And he's somebody that, I think this year is going to put up some solid numbers. And if you're down there looking at, do you take a Jay Cutler, a Phillip Rivers, Joe Flacco? I mean, personally, I like Carson Palmer over all those guys. You can always count on Jay Cutler for a couple of 4-interception games throughout the season, and I've actually never been high on Flacco at all. So at the quarterback slot, I really like Carson Palmer this year. And then, if you look at the running back position, in general, the running back position in the NFL has been devalued with the 2- and 3-back system. So you really only have, maybe the top 10 guys are worth, that feature back position who's really going to be a workhorse for you. Once you get beyond, say maybe a David Wilson, drafting in the middle, middle teens of the running back position, I like Stephen Ridley as a top 10, which isn't much of a sleeper pick, but a lot of people have him down in the teens. I actually think he's going to be a top 10 back. New England's going to be featuring the run a lot this year. Eddie Lacy is another name that's picking up steam recently. I've actually been high on Eddie Lacy since the draft, just figuring that the Packers are going to want to try to run the ball more and take some pressure off of Aaron Rodgers. The problem there is their offensive line is terrible. I did hear you guys talking at the top of the show about Rashard Mendenhall. I haven't seen the latest on his injury, but he was somebody I was highest on. Did I hear you guys say that he had some broken bones? Is he done for a while?
No, that was actually Jonathan Cooper, the rookie guard.
Oh, okay.
He broke his leg out for the season.
Oh, okay. I thought I heard Mendenhall, because I know he had an MRI on his knee.
Yeah,
Mendenhall had a minor injury, but I do believe he'll be ready to go week 1.
Yeah, he has a sprained knee, and Arian said he'll be good to go week 1.
Yeah, I'm pretty high on Mendenhall. Also down towards the bottom of the draft, in the 30s, you've got Ben Tate, who Arian Foster's already hurt, so Tate's a good pick, which isn't much of a sleeper. People know about him. And then you've got, the Denver situation is interesting. You've got Noshawn Moreno, you got Ronnie Hillman, you got Monty Ball. And kind of keep an eye on that one, see where it goes. But that's kind of where I'm looking at as far as sleepers at the quarterback and running back position.
Scott, who do you think is going to come out of that running back battle in Denver?
The name the thing with Peyton Manning and his audibles at the line of scrimmage and all of his checks and everything, I think the fact that Noshawn Moreno's been there and knows the system, knows Peyton Manning, and probably has a comfort level with Peyton Manning, I think he's probably the favorite only because of familiarity. But Manning's going to figure out who can block for him, who can pass block, who can catch the ball out of the backfield, who can protect him, and that's who's going to rise. But I would put Noshawn Moreno as kind of the front runner just based on his experience with Peyton Manning.
Okay.
Jumping back just for a second about Carson Palmer and Rashard Mendenhall, I agree with you about Palmer. That someone in the later rounds I've targeted consistently, just because he is a really good quarterback with a lot of weapons there in Arizona that he didn't have in Oakland, and I felt like he could put up good numbers. But with Jonathan Cooper going down for the season, the offensive line is going to have to shuffle now. It's going to look more like the offensive line last year that gave up the NFL record in sacks and just completely decimated 3 quarterback seasons. Are you more worried now about Palmer and even Mendenhall not having Cooper in the lineup now?
I would be more concerned about Mendenhall at the guard position, trying to open up those inside holes for him. I think Palmer, when you've got Fitzgerald and some weapons on the outside, I think they'll be able to function better. I don't remember offhand how Fitzgerald had last year. Probably, he was probably a top 10, 12, 15 wide receiver with, Josh Skelton and you and me throwing the ball to him. So I think if you throw in a Carson Palmer who's serviceable at quarterback, that's just going to help Fitzgerald's numbers for sure. But, Carson Palmer's not a top 10 guy, but he's definitely, if you're down there in the, like I said, the Jay Cutler, Joe Flacco, Sam Bradford range, I would definitely take Palmer's upside over those guys.
Okay. All right, Scott, let's kind of change it here to guys you're kind of avoiding here this year. We know who you like in the later rounds. Who are some of these guys you're avoiding pretty much at all costs this year, and why?
Well, there's I'll jump back into the running back position. This is something I've actually been talking about on my site, my radio show for a little while, and it's going to be a little bit of a shock, I think, to probably some people. I've been down on Adrian Peterson and Arian Foster going into this season.
AP?
Yes, I have.
What?
And yeah, I know.
I'm just a Vikings fan. That's just my inner Viking coming out. That's all. No worries.
Well, Foster for injury concerns, and he kind of proved me right so far with the latest on his back and this nerve injury. Adrian Peterson, last year obviously he came back from a knee injury, defied all odds, and put up almost 2,100 yards. And I went back and looked at running backs that put up 2,000-yard seasons over the past, going back all the way to O.J. Simpson and these guys. And for the most part, the backs have a poor season coming off of 2,000 yards because of excessive carries and all that. So, when you look at guys like Chris Johnson and these other guys that had 2,000 yards, the next year their stats all went down, and in some cases considerably down. So, the knee injury, which, he's a year out of, all these carries, all these yards, I've actually had targeted Peterson and Foster for a step back this year based on injury concerns and wear and tear.
Yeah, everyone's chronicled the running backs over the course of the NFL history, the 2,000-yard rushers. The following year, they do have a setback. They do kind of come back down to earth, so to speak. That being said, Adrian Peterson, in my mind, I still believe is going to be the number 1 or number 2 overall back when the season is over. Who do you have ahead of Adrian Peterson, saying that Adrian Peterson, in your mind, is going to be, in line for a down season?
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting. You look at this group, and I'll just kind of put them in a group and then maybe separate them a little bit.
Okay.
Doug Martin, Marshawn Lynch, Ray Rice, Jamal Charles, LaShawn McCoy. I see that as kind of the bundle. Now, who comes out of that group? Each guy has a different, pluses and minuses. Doug Martin in Tampa, he's a second-year guy, showed some flash last year. The rest of their offensive weapons have questions around him. Marshawn Lynch has had some question marks with his health a little bit, but he's got, one of the best offensive lines in the league. Ray Rice is getting some tread on the tires. LaShawn McCoy, questions around the Chip Kelly offense. I like LaShawn McCoy because Philly's going to run a lot of plays, obviously, with this Chip Kelly offense, but he's just going to get more touches. And then Jamal Charles, I'm really high on the Chiefs this year. I like Alex Smith. I like Andy Reid. So there's this bundle, and it's hard for me to pick one. If I had to go with somebody, I would probably go Marshawn Lynch because of the offensive line. But any one of those 5 guys, I would be more comfortable taking over Adrian Peterson.
Wow. That's interesting. I don't think I've heard anyone give a list that long before. What about C.J. Spiller? You mentioned most of the players like him, Jamal Charles, LaShawn McCoy, the pass catching, running, sort of do-it-all backs. Do you have him in that group too, or where are you placing him?
Yeah, he's actually outside of that group for me. Even before the quarterback situation, he's an electric back. Obviously, he can break it at any point, but he's one that I could see he'd give you 180 yards and 3 touchdowns, and the next week he'd give you 15 carries for 3 yards and nothing. And that was before they lost their, poor quarterback situation. So now you're talking, you look at week 1, they played New England. The Patriots are going to put 10 guys in the box. I mean, I don't think anyone's afraid of their, tool, this quarterback that the Bills are going to roll out there. So I think with the quarterback situation there, it's going to hurt him even more because teams are going to just completely ignore their passing attack unless Matt Leinart, revitalizes his career and takes a step back to 2007 or whatever.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That's something we never actually touched on in the first segment when it comes to injuries. Kevin Cobb goes down with a looks to be a serious concussion. You got E.J. Manuel already out. What kind of effect does that have on C.J. Spiller's stock going into the season? He might be onto something there. It might be worth fantasy owners taking notice and kind of maybe hedging their bets a little bit as far as who they're going to draft early on in the first round.
Yeah, you got to be careful about, and then what's his health situation? I think last year he got nicked up a little bit. Are they going to put 300 carries on him? That would be a lot on him to try to carry all by himself.
Very true. Very true. Thanks for bringing that up, Scott, because we literally didn't think about injuries and just completely overlooked it. I think we're running out of time here. I just wanted to thank you for coming on talking fantasy with us, Scott. Do you want to take a second to tell everyone where they can find your work on the internet, where they can find you on Twitter and everything like that?
Sure. The website is footballextrapoints.com. The staff and I are covering, obviously, fantasy football and all things football all the time. I'm on Twitter at footballxps, and I'm on there every day. And then the show, I just made an announcement actually last night. We're moving our show to Sundays, 12:30 for a kickoff show on RF Sports Radio. So we'll be giving some last-minute fantasy advice, injury updates, and picks for the game. So you can check us out there, and we'll be full speed now that the season's getting ready to start.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Scott. And I'm sure we'll have you on again during the season.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for having me, guys.
Have a good one.
Appreciate you coming on.
Football fans, check out ProFootballCentral.com for all the latest NFL news and analysis. Also, check out the very popular Pro Football Central radio network for awesome NFL talk around the league. Go to ProFootballCentral.com. ProFootballCentral.com.
And welcome back to Fantasy Forecast Central Radio. We are joined now by Allie Fontana, a Fantasy Pros approved expert, writer for the FantasyFix.com and FantasyFootballConfidential.com. And she's also a 2012 FSWA award winner for the best print article. Allie, how's it going today?
I'm doing great. How are you today? I'm excited to be on the show.
Awesome. We are excited to have you. So let's jump right in and look at some late round strategy. For purposes here, let's talk 12-team, standard, PPR, whichever you prefer. Looking at from rounds 10 on, so 10 to 16, 10 to 20, however big your league is. How do you personally go about filling your team? Do you have a specific strategy you go into this with, or do you more just play it by ear and feel out everyone else's strategies?
Well, I think you have to be flexible and sort of roll with the flow of the draft. Sometimes you see a great value, and it's hard to pass up. But for me, when I'm looking in rounds 10 or later, I'm really looking for upside with my bench picks. And I get aggressive about targeting those players. I'd rather take a shot late after I build my starters around guys that are consistent, that are reliable, that I'm not going to worry if I take somebody in the fourth round that they're maybe not going to be ready to roll week one, that I'm not going to get production out of them. But later in the draft, I like to be aggressive and sort of bypass the name type players. People have been around. Nate Washington, I like his game. He was good, but, I'm going to bypass Nate Washington and maybe look for a player like a Mohamed Sanu or a Chris Givens is a guy I like. Now his ADP has gone up because, he's flashed in the preseason. But I'm looking to be aggressive with picks, not sort of drafting the guys who have been around. So that's a strategy for me that's worked in the past, where I build a bench around people who have a shot at emerging over the course of the season. And if I've invested a late pick and they don't pan out, I feel a lot less depressed if I have to cut them or, move on from them than I would if I invested in somebody, early like that. So that's a general strategy for me late.
Okay, and follow up to that, people are all over the board when it comes to kickers and defenses. Some people would rather, I don't want to call it reach, but take one a little earlier to get, like that Seattle defense. For you, I know personally for me, it's I designate the last two picks, one for defense, one for kicker, and I don't even worry about that position until that point. Do you look at it the same way, or are you comfortable maybe like say round 11 grabbing one of those higher end defenses if they're still there?
I have to say never. The only way is if your scoring system is one of those, some sort of specialized thing where it makes some sense to reach, but I'm a person who's very comfortable streaming the defense. I've taken the Colts late in a number of drafts, but you have to kind of be of that mindset that you're willing to do that. Look every week on the wire to see who's available, but it's a lot of fun playing against really crappy offenses, and there are those offenses that give for fantasy goodness even to a bad defense. So I never invest in an early defense ever, and I'm always surprised when I see people do it on a regular basis. Going for the 49ers or the Seahawks, which are great defenses. I rode the Seahawks last year. I picked them up late. They didn't have the same expectation that we have this year, and I drafted them late a lot or picked them off the waiver wire in some cases, and then you keep them because they're on your roster. But I'd never reach for a kicker, defense, or anything like that ever.
All right, Allie, let's play a little game. We'll play a little game called Hot and Cold. We'll each take a guy that we're pretty high on, and we'll each take a guy that we're kind of staying away from. I'll go first. The guy I'm hot on right now is Zach Sudfeld. Ugh, got tongue twisted. Zach Sudfeld, the rookie tight end out of New England. I'm pretty excited about the prospects of this guy so far this preseason. He's 90 yards and a touchdown. He's being used much like the guy he's replacing in that offense, Aaron Hernandez. He's being split out as a slot receiver at times, as we've seen in the preseason. And I believe with Tom Brady at the quarterback position and, in that offense, I think he really could make a rookie splash the way Rob Gronkowski did. Allie, who are you hot on this year?
Well, I'm going to choke this name out because I've just recently come around, and it's not somebody that he was a guy that I was not looking at all, but given the state of sort of the tight end situation, I'm actually considering now, hard to say, Jermichael Finley. And, we've been waiting for him to have, a good year for, the last three years, basically, after he kind of flashed in the postseason, and then you just kind of never realized his potential. And the reason that I'm warming up to him is simply just looking at the wasteland that is the tight end situation. What's a little concerning now is that, of course, his draft position, he's going earlier. I looked back in July, you could get him, late 9th, 10th round. This past weekend, he was around a 7th round pick. I don't think I'd want him that early, but, people have to make their own decisions. But I do think that, he was a huge part of the offense that we've seen this summer. He was very involved. And even the coaches and Rodgers and everyone was talking him up, and he seems really healthy. And but then you watch the game, and he had that drop there. He didn't make that touchdown, or it was. He's just that kind of player, and I think he could continue to do that. But I do like his opportunity. And when you're looking at tight ends, I typically wait 11th, 12th round. I don't feel there's a lot of consistency, so that's another position that I stream. But I'm looking to mix up because, like you guys, I've been drafting since May, June. So I'm looking to kind of vary my team composition a bit and maybe take a shot on somebody that I was cold on before. So I am warming up to him. If I can get him in the 9th round, I think that's fair enough. I'll either just see how he pans out, and if he doesn't, then I'll look for somebody off the waiver wire because they always emerge. So I'm warming up to him just because I think he has looked better in the preseason. But, he's a guy that you just have to accept that he may not pan out. But if you're looking for somebody who could also be a top 5 potential, he's a guy that can do that.
All right, Nick, who are you hot on right now?
Well, I just want to touch on both of yours really quick. For Zach Sudfeld, I agree with you for the most part. The one thing that concerns me about people expecting him to replace Aaron Hernandez is the one difference is they're not going to hand Sudfeld the ball out of the backfield like they did with Hernandez. So you're going to miss out on, a tiny, tiny little chunk of fantasy points there. Nothing to really be worried about, just something fantasy owners should keep in mind when they get really excited about, a new Aaron Hernandez in the offense. There's a little bit of a difference. For Allie, I'm with you. Jermichael Finley and I have a unique history of being a Packer fan. He's one of those guys that I have an irrational fear of that I steer clear of, but I see it. The guy has all the potential in the world, and like you say, if you can get him in the late 9th or the 10th, I've actually taken him in a couple of leagues at that time. But if he's going in like the 7th round, I can't justify taking someone that high. And for me, it's another irrational fear guy that all of a sudden I just finally put it aside, and I've drafted him almost three leagues in a row, 3 out of 4, something like that, is Chris Johnson from Tennessee. I have steered clear of him for maybe, I want to say like 3 seasons now, which I understand is just insane considering he finished 12th, 9th, and 6th for fantasy running backs the last 3 years. For me, I just saw him as a guy that wasn't getting it done, but the numbers clearly tell a different story. So between the new offensive line, seeing that awesome preseason performance so far, I just decided to say screw it because this is a guy you can still grab, early to mid 2nd round. And that's a good value for someone like that. When for me, if I go running back, he's going to be my running back 2. And I think if you can have Chris Johnson as your running back 2, you're going to do well all day.
I think Chris Johnson is really taking advantage of that, improved O-line play, and he looks more decisive and he's finishing his runs better than he has in the last couple of years. And it is interesting about perception, how a lot of people said he was a bust in all of this in the past years. But the issue with him was simply that he wasn't consistent. I mean, the thing that you're looking for is it's great to have, some big games, but you really want somebody that's going to deliver points for you week in and week out. And that was the rub with him, I think, that he didn't do that on a consistent basis. And you could see he was, trying too hard to make every run a big run instead of just, taking what he could out of each run. So I do like him too a lot.
Yeah, I saw a crazy stat on him not too long ago. Somebody had tweeted it out, and I can't remember who it was, but it was a stat regarding his touchdowns last year, and Chris Johnson had as many 80-plus yard touchdown runs last year as he did touchdown runs inside the 20-yard line. And to me, that I don't know, I I know their big touchdown runs are exciting and whatnot, but I think I would rather have more consistency in, with the shorter yards when you're inside the red zone, when you're inside, even when you're inside the 30 or 40 yard line, as opposed to hoping against hope that maybe he breaks one for 80 or 90 yards and goes the distance. For me personally, I think I would rather take a guy who's going to be more consistent when they're in the enemy's territory, so to speak. But that's just me.
Yeah, definitely. So, moving on from the hot, let's go to the cold side now. For me, I think that guy has to be Ryan Tannehill right now. Going back to maybe late May, early June, this is a guy I was targeting regularly as my QB2 in most of my dynasty leagues. And lately, this is a guy I don't want to touch. I think mainly it is watching the preseason, which I know you're not supposed to take too much stock in, but, a battered offensive line that is missing Jake Long. Tannehill looks out of sync. He's not hitting his wide receivers in stride. He doesn't have a rhythm. He looks confused and gun-shy in the pocket, trying to tuck and run too much. So for me, that's a guy I'm just steering completely clear of all of a sudden. And for once, I'm actually letting the preseason kind of make a decision for me. What about you, Allie? Who are you just steering clear of at all costs?
Well, my eyes seem to glaze over the draft list when I come to this guy, and that's Stevie Johnson. I regularly bypass him. He had some injuries that he was dealing with in the off season and in the early part of the preseason, so he wasn't really active and we didn't see a lot of him. But mainly now, when you look at the situation in Buffalo with the quarterback uncertainty, I do like E.J. Manuel, and I think it'll improve when he's back in the lineup. But the Cobb injury, there's just some bad kind of vibes there. And I just feel like if I'm looking for a third receiver, there are other guys that I would regularly take over him right now. And so for me, he's a guy that I just won't draft. Simply won't look at him for, maybe it's irrational, but I don't know. I think maybe some of his best game is behind him, and I think there are other exciting guys that I want to have on my roster than Stevie Johnson.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I don't know if he's someone I avoid, really, but I've noticed whenever I come to his sort of ADP slot, there's always someone else I'd rather have.
Right. That's it. It's just, there are some exciting, the thing is we talk about how deep wide receiver is, and there are a lot of options. There are a lot of guys that have tremendous potential and upside. Now, whether they deliver on that is another story, but you certainly have a ton of options. So I guess I'm just looking more at those guys when I'm building my roster for the third wide receiver, or even the fourth, because I've seen him available when I was picking my fourth guy too. Industry leagues are a little different than sort of your non-industry leagues, because people are all kind of, interested in some of the same people. So it's interesting who drops. And he's one of those guys that I just don't draft.
And what about you, Brian? Who's your cold guy?
Well, I'm gonna go back to New England, and I'm gonna say right now the guy I'm steering clear of, and I'm probably in the minority in this, is Danny Amendola. And obviously, it's nothing talent related. We know what the guy can do. He was obviously legit with the Rams. It's simply injury concerns, and I hate to use injury proneness, but it's a real issue with him. Last year, he missed a significant amount of time with collarbone injury. He came back, and I believe he played 2 games and was injured again. And if I remember right, he missed the rest of the season. If he stays healthy, he could be someone steal the draft. It's just it's that simple. Especially in that offense, it looks like Tom Brady has developed some trust with him. But I just, me personally, I think I'm steering clear of Danny Amendola just because I feel like come week 3 or 4, I'm going to be, perusing the waiver wire looking for a wide receiver replacement. So he's a guy I'm pretty cold on this season.
Yeah, I tend to have a. Oh, go ahead, Allie.
No, I was just going to say, you could, some people I've seen have taken like a flyer, believe it or not, on Edelman, or sort of handcuffed Edelman to Danny Amendola. So if you have the roster spot to do that and you like Amendola, that may not be a bad idea because he does know the system. But, it is a risk-reward with him. And he did miss 20 of 32 games in the past 2 years. So, it's his style of play. And he's definitely, for a guy who's not very big, he's not afraid to take a hit, and that can certainly be to your detriment. But it's a roll of the dice. I agree.
Yeah, you're right. And Aaron Dobson's another guy that you could handcuff to Danny Amendola if you wanted to, draft Amendola onto your team. But for me, I would just, it's just a personal preference, like you were talking about earlier with Stevie Johnson. I just, for me, I'm just going elsewhere, especially with the, how deep wide receiver position is this year. There's definitely other options out there.
Yeah, I think I have an aversion in general to high injury risk players. Amendola is a guy I don't target very often. I think if I did, like you guys mentioned, I would definitely try to handcuff him with a Julian Edelman, Kendall Tompkins, even Aaron Dobson, somebody. But even like a Run DMC or a DeMarco Murray, all players like that, I recognize their potential value, but the potential risk for injury is just too great for me. And you can usually find someone of similar fantasy output that has a better track record for staying healthy at a similar draft position. So I usually, for the most part, I steer clear of risky injury players, for whatever reason. Another one of those irrational fears. I might have the most irrational fears of any fantasy player.
The truth comes out.
Yeah. Well, it's something we've talked about on my other show and on here for a couple weeks now, and it's like I just keep finding more and more that I didn't even know about. It's like self-therapy on the radio.
Yeah, I think it's great. Well, I think part of, when you talk to owners or people who ask you for advice, I always think there is part of our role as advisors is a little bit of a therapist, because people have different thresholds for risk, avoidance, different tolerance for, going for a broke. And, if somebody doesn't pan out in the first week of the season, they're ready to sort of turn their rosters upside down. So I think we are, in a way, therapists, and sometimes we need to be talked off the ledge ourselves.
That's a really good point. Thank you for making me sound not so crazy.
You're not alone.
Awesome. So let's look at some stock watch. This is a sort of interesting concept we talked about the other day. Let's look at a guy all of us have had our eyes on whose stock is recently on the rise. For me, I'm going to go with tight end Jordan Cameron. I hopped on the train early here. I've been sort of weirdly a Whedon supporter over the last 6 to 8 months, saying he deserved another shot, natural progression, yada, yada. He's shown that he can actually get it done, and Jordan Cameron's been a beast so far this preseason. We've watched his ADP sort of skyrocket. It's sort of starting to level off now, but it had sort of a meteoric rise for a while. I was on board until it got to about where it is now. It's a little too high for my taste anymore, because you can get, now he's being drafted way before guys like Martellus Bennett, who I have a big crush on. So I don't know if I'm still buying this high, but it's definitely a player I'm highly interested in. What about you, Allie?
Yeah, well, I'm going back to New England. It seems like Bill has us under his spell. The guy that I like and who I have targeted instead of Danny Amendola is actually Kenbrell Tompkins. Now, I like Kenbrell Tompkins. I know that he has a lot of hype as sort of like the preseason superstar, but he's actually shown that he may be a guy that is worth that hype. And again, I was drafting him, 14th or the last pick. His ADP is moving up, and I would take him if I can get him as my fourth wide receiver somewhere in, the 9th, 10th, 11th round, I'm doing it. The Lions secondary is bad, but, he caught 8 of 12 targets for 116 yards. He plays bigger than his size. He knows how to outmuscle defensive backs for throws that are contested. So he's the kind of guy that you look for and you want to have on your roster. So I'm kind of all in as a late pick or as a fourth wide receiver on Kenbrell Tompkins.
That's for me, that is a guy I'm targeting as well. And if you look at Pro Football Focus's player grade so far for the preseason, he's actually rated right now as the 36th best wide receiver. So, I mean, to put that in perspective, that makes him a legitimate wide receiver 3, really. And solid numbers here across the board, and he's higher than a lot of receivers that are being drafted a lot higher than him in the fantasy world. So I think you're right on the money there. Sometimes, it's hard to take too much away from the preseason, but he's graded against first-team offenses and a lot of solid receivers here, and he's coming out ahead of a lot of good guys. So I think as long as his ADP doesn't get too high, I would love to have Kembo Thompkins as my 4th wide receiver.
Yeah, I think people, it just depends on where you draft and, how early and who your league mates are, because others are focusing on him too, but I do like him a lot. So he's a guy that is on my draft board in every draft, if I can
definitely. Oh, what about you, Brian? Who's the guy that you have your eyes on?
Guy I have my eyes on is a guy that I know Allie also has her eyes on. She mentioned him earlier, and her and I actually had a brief conversation last week about him, and that's Mohamed Sanu. I feel like Allie and I are the only ones who are high on this guy, and I don't really know why. I know he struggled early on in 2012 as a rookie, but he came on strong at the end of the season, or towards the end of the season, with 4 touchdowns in a 3-game stretch before he ended his season or before a stretch factor ended his season. He's had a really solid preseason, 52 yards receiving so far this year and a touchdown. Obviously AJ Green's going to be the focus of defensive coverage, and that's going to pull coverages his way. He will be the number 2 receiver for Cincinnati come week 1, and I think in that offense, with the additions that they've made, I think he's he could be poised for a really solid year. He could be a wide receiver 3 with low end wide receiver 2 potential. So I'm looking at Mohamed Sanu in the late rounds. I know he's being drafted right now somewhere in that late 13th round range, but I would have no problem taking him, in the 11th round as a wide receiver 3 or flex type option. So I'm gonna do everything I can to draft him in every one of my leagues and have him on the bench and ready to go when he breaks out this year, because I'm calling it right now. Breakout year, Mohamed Sanu.
Yeah, I love him. He should only get single coverage, with AJ Green and some of the other weapons. He was a good red zone target last year, and I think he has that potential this year. I guess, since we're looking for balance, and I'm on him too. He's a guy that I have been high on since, the spring. I guess the only concern would be, that sometimes he may be inconsistent, especially now because they brought in Tyler Eifert and Giovanni Bernard. And so, it depends on how they spread that ball around. But I agree with you. He works the underneath areas very well. And, if he gets a few catches a game and he's that red zone guy, he's going to deliver. And he's cheap. And he's actually one of the few guys that was either a breakout or sleeper type that still has that value. When you look back at the guys that have been sort of propped up, so many of them have moved up draft boards, but you can still get him at a good value, and he can deliver much greater return for you, which is something that you're looking for.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of shocked. His ADP hasn't risen really at all this year, and I think he's done enough in the preseason to warrant his ADP to move up a little bit. So I think there's tons of value in Mohamed Sanu, and I'm looking to draft him in every one of my leagues this year. So let's turn it to stock who's fallen. Right now, I'm pretty low on, and in my eyes, I think Eli Manning's stock has fallen a little bit. He's had a pretty rough preseason to date. Games 1 and 2, he went combined 10 for 22 for 164 yards, a touchdown and a pick. And then in game 3, he was just 8 for 20 for 83 yards. didn't look too comfortable in that offense. The offense in general didn't look that crisp. This is an offense that should put up, or in the past has put up plenty of points, and with those receivers and that running back situation, you'd think that Eli Manning would be poised for somewhere in the 30 touchdowns and pressing 3,500 yards or more. I just didn't see anything this preseason that would make me feel comfortable in drafting him, even as a late round QB option. I don't know about what you guys seen with Eli Manning, but right now his stock has fallen in my eyes. Allie, who do you have as have you seen as your stock has fallen in your eyes?
Okay, well, this guy was already sort of a guy that I wasn't very high on, but after watching Phillip Rivers in the preseason, I would really do. I actually drafted him, or the San Diego team quarterback, as my team quarterback in the Race to the Bottom league, which is that inverted fantasy league where the goal is to score the fewest points each week. And
that sounds awesome, by the way.
and so Phillip Rivers is my guy. I mean, I was picking 9th or 10th, so some of the better options were off. But which is awful because I was sort of looking forward. I love Demario Alexander, but of course, he's gone. The Malcolm Floyd injury, it looks like he may be on track. Vincent Brown, he's going to need more help than Vincent Brown, but we haven't really seen Vincent Brown do very much in the preseason, so kind of what's up with that? He has Keenan Allen coming up, but Keenan Allen also has kind of a bad knee. The O-line is bad. I mean, he was 5 for 9 for 50 yards with a pick and a lost fumble against the Bears last week. This looks like, and I also think that his own play is slipping regardless of what they say. So he was a guy that, I'd take a Brandon Weeden as my QB2 and go with that upside and feel comfortable taking like a Phillip Rivers based on what we've seen. So his stock was down, but it's going way, way down for me.
Yeah, that's one of those things where it was already low, and it's about to go through the basement. Anytime you have a quarterback that almost no one is sold on anymore, and he loses 2 receivers, well, at least one for sure, and then another one for short term, it's reason to be concerned. I hopped off the Phillip Rivers wagon a few years ago, so unless I was in a league like that, you race to the bottom, I probably wouldn't touch it either. And I have a question: Did the hipsters set up that league?
It was Eye of the Gator, and I know that Miller, who used to be Fantasy Jedi, he was involved in that last year, but the commissioner is Eye of the Gator.
Oh, okay, because that sounded like a hipster league. That sounded like something he would start.
It's fun, but you really have conflict. Fantasy gold means a very different thing in this league.
Yeah, it's interesting though. It keeps you on your toes. Gets you to look at it from a different perspective.
It does.
So for me, the guy whose ADP has fallen, and being a Packer fan, it sort of shocks me that this saddens me. But it's Kyle Rudolph, the tight end from the Minnesota Vikings.
Sure,
this
that
is a
really
guy.
Saddens you.
It does, because this is the guy I'm a big fan of. And let's be honest here. I think I'm the only guy still driving the Christian Ponder hype train. I liked what I saw from him as a game manager last year. From a pure scouting standpoint, I never thought he was going to be great, but I thought he could do a really good job in that offense. You give him more weapons now this year, and he was poised to sort of take that next step, progress to a better game manager, make better decisions. And his favorite target, Kyle Rudolph, was clearly the guy to benefit. And we saw it with his ADP, being one of the higher tight ends taken, especially as tight end after tight end after tight end continued to fall. But now after watching Ponder's just terrible preseason performance, we're watching Rudolph's ADP kind of plummet. And I guess groupthink is sort of right here. If Ponder really does suck that bad, Rudolph's not going to get the catches he needs to be, that fantasy stud tight end like he was last year. So this is a guy I've watched his ADP fall recently, and it's a guy I'm a lot more weary of taking than I was a month ago, right before preseason started. I don't think I'm looking at him as anything more than a tight end 2 for me at this point.
Well, I mean, when it comes to Kyle Rudolph, last year all of his touchdowns came inside the 20-yard line or from 20 yards in.
Yep.
I mean, he didn't do really anything in between the 20s at all. And I've been kind of alone in this thought that this year, if Ponder doesn't step up his game in weeks 1 through 4, Matt Castle's going to be the starting quarterback because this team made the playoffs last year. They're not looking to take a step backward. Leslie Frazier is not going to, waste the season, on a guy that, they drafted in the first round just because he's a first-round quarterback pick or whatever. That's not going to be the case. They're going to look to make a playoff push, and if that means changing quarterbacks and putting Matt Castle in, that's what they'll do. If Matt Castle is the quarterback at some point in the season, I do think Kyle Rudolph will have, his season will get much better, and especially in between the 20s. And, if Rudolph's stock, is dropping it, as you're saying it is currently, that's going to be some great value for somebody, later on in the season, because they're not going to give Ponder, he's on a short leash as much as people are saying that's not the case. They're not going to risk the season and fall back out of the playoffs after they went 10-6 last year, and made the playoffs, even though it was basically on, the shoulders of Adrian Peterson. They're going to look to improve upon last season, and if that means Matt Castle, so be it. And I don't think Kyle Rudolph's going to have, the horrible season, that, everyone thinks he is because of the horrible preseason that Christian Ponder has had.
Yeah, I've been kind of cold on him too, but I do think that that's a great perspective that you bring in there. If they did make that switch, it would make him more attractive. And a lot of these guys, it really depends on the value where you get them. And there's some tight ends, like remember Shanko, when he didn't get those touchdowns after he had that really big season with double digits, then he was really nothing. But he was drafted very, inside as a top 10 tight end, and then he was delivered nothing. Mercedes Lewis had that one big year where they used him and he caught a lot of touchdowns, but then he was blocking and used sparingly after that. So some people may have drafted him early because of all those TDs and those looks in the red zone, but I do think that it's something to consider. If his stock continues to fall, then he becomes value. If you want to take a shot on him, you don't have much to lose.
Yeah, I agree. You guys make good points. Being a Vikings fan, someone that covers the Vikings, watches the Vikings a lot, Brian, I trust your opinion more about the whole Matt Castle situation than most people because for me, I had no idea if they would actually bring him in or not. I thought they'd just stick it out with Ponder. If it was me, I would obviously switch to Castle, though, if Ponder doesn't get it done. So for the last one... Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just, the GMs, when they get in front of the cameras and they play the poker face, they're not going to say, yeah, we're bringing Matt Castle in, to be the starting quarterback. They say we're bringing him in. He's going to offer competition for Christian Ponder, so on and so forth. But you don't bring a guy like Matt Castle in, who's had success in the past. He's brought the Chiefs to the playoffs. He did go 11-5 with the New England Patriots, albeit with Randy Moss and the weapons on that team back then. But he has had success in the past, and he's shown he can play in this league where Christian Ponder hasn't. And I just really believe, as much as coaches and GMs get in front of the camera and they say basically nothing to us, there's something behind bringing in a guy like Matt Castle. I just really believe that if the Vikes are 1-3, and I know we're getting off the track here a little bit, but if the Vikings are 1-3, you're gonna see Castle starting week 5. I really do.
Okay. So for the last question, we've looked at ADP risers, we've looked at fallers. Let's look at the guys who have pretty much held more or less steady for the whole off season. For me, it's sort of, and maybe all of these will be no-brainers, I'm not sure, but for me, it's Doug Martin. This is probably one of the few guys I would consider taking 1 overall in a redraft league instead of Adrian Peterson. I'd still probably take Adrian Peterson, though. I love the muscle hamster. I landed him in like the 9th round as my running back 3 last year. Ended up, making the switch to running back 1 by like week 5 and riding him to a championship. I love his skill set. I love, with that offensive line intact and healthy, what they can do, especially with Josh Freeman struggling. So I'm all in on Doug Martin, and I always have been. Nothing's really changed for me there. What about you, Allie?
Well, a guy that's been fairly steady looking at ADP and also in sort of my assessment is Steven Jackson. If you're looking for, a pick, an RB2, I think he could be a low-end RB1 in maybe a 14-team league if you're in PPR and you believe in him. But I think he's a nice RB2 if you can get him. And the first preseason game was a little scary. He did look really slow and sluggish, but he stepped things up. He looked good in the 3rd preseason game. He had that nice 11-yard run right out of the gate. He remains to be seen how active he is in the passing game, but the opportunity will be there. He had 3 for 15 yards in that same game, but I think he looks good to go. He's a guy that is consistent, and he's on a better offense, and hopefully he adds touchdowns to, which is something that he hasn't had very many of in the past so many seasons with the Rams. So I think he's a guy that's been steady, and you can feel fairly confident using a pick on him as your RB2. And he's a guy that I'm okay with where he's been from the beginning of the preseason until heading into week 1. Hello?
Yeah. Sorry, I was talking on mute. I have this terrible habit of doing that. I'm with you. S-Jax is someone I've always been high on, and I actually wrote an article about this a couple weeks ago. Being in an offense with St. Louis that just had nothing, where they constantly stacked 8, 9, 10 in the box against him, and he was still able to be, a top 10, top 15 fantasy running back year in and year out. He's going to a team with a decent offensive line, but so many offensive weapons to keep it open for him that there's really no reason he shouldn't be a high-end running back 2. Like you said, maybe even a fringe running back 1 in 14-team leagues. So that's a great one, Allie. I really like that. And I wasn't aware that his ADP is holding steady. He's one of those guys, for whatever reason, I don't pay much attention to. I've never drafted him, to be honest, in like 3 years, and it's not even irrational so much as there's always someone there I like more. Everybody has their crushes in the first couple rounds.
It looks like a flat line almost. I'm using Fantasy Football Calculator only because I think my fantasy league, so many expert drafts, and I think sometimes things are a little skewed that way. A little bit so, but it's like a flat line. Hasn't moved. A little dip in the middle of August, maybe after that first or right after the first game. People probably went into a panic after that first preseason game, but then it's kind of gone and it's just like a flat line, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd round.
And that's a great place to get someone like that. There are no worries there. Brian, what about you? Who's your guy that you've kept an eye on that's just holding steady?
Well, it's a guy that, in my opinion, seems to have just dipped under the radar and for no apparent reason. I know we've talked about him, in earlier shows, but for me, it's Alfred Morris. This is a guy that put up 1,600 yards last year, 13 touchdowns, and he's going to put up solid RB1 type numbers again this year, yet he's falling to the bottom of the first round in even 10-team redraft leagues. And I think somebody who's picking at the end of the first round, whether it be a 10-team or even a 12-team league, if he seems to be falling in some 12-team leagues as well, is going to get a fantastic running back 1 at the end of the first round who's going to put up numbers close to similar to what he did last year. And I feel like the reason he's going under the radar is because of all the RG3 hype. There was so much talk about RG3 and his ACL injury. Is he going to play? Is he not going to play? Blah, blah, blah. And I think Alfred Morris is just kind of fallen off into the shadows because of all that hype behind Robert Griffin III. And, I personally don't understand why his ADP's so low as far as, in the first round. But, that's some great value for somebody there drafting at the end of round 1, in my opinion.
I love Alf. I think you have the Shanahan effect, and there's been some talk in the last 3 to 4 weeks about Roy Halou, and there are people who believe that somehow Roy Halou, Shanahan will be up to his Shanahanigans and somehow, kind of cast Morris aside. I don't believe it. I do like Roy Halou as a late pick. Because pickings get kind of slim there sometimes. So I think he's fine as a bench RB5 or maybe 6, depending on how many roster spots. But I agree with you. Morris is just, he's sort of been forgotten. But I don't think it has anything to do with him. It's, as you said, the hype around the drama. I live in the D.C. area, and there was all the drama with Shanahan and RG3 and when he's coming back and all of this. So in the meantime, he's flying under the radar, but you can get a good deal on him, and he has every opportunity to return more than what you get. And you can't say that for a guy, who's a real RB1, a legitimate RB1 with touchdown threats. It's just too bad they don't use him in the passing game, but I think that solid and steady and reliable is okay when you're looking for those early picks.
Yeah, and I think it's funny that you mentioned, the passing game, because Nick actually mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about Alfred Morris. He's in PPR leagues. He actually finished off, and I can't remember, he was in the top 5, running backs in even PPR leagues, and that was actually with, I want to say, 77 total receiving yards last year. And I believe he's going to, this year, Nick and I both believe that that's going to improve this year. He's going to get more, catches out of the backfield. He's going to get more playing time on third and longs, third down, third and long. So he's going to see more opportunities to catch the ball out of the backfield. And I think his value, even in PPR leagues, is great where he's being drafted currently.
Yeah, I've seen him, Morris, Lynch even, and Stephen Ridley as RB2 picks. And if you can land one of them as your RB2 in a PPR league, that is amazing in my opinion, because that is, consistency, steady, and guys who are the workhorses for their teams. So, Ridley has green this year, but I still think he comes through. I still like him a lot.
Yeah, Alfred Morris is one of my huge crushes. I've been on him all day, basically since the end of last season. And it's one of those things, in college he showed an ability to catch the ball and make plays in the passing game. He's been working all off season to work on, being a pass catcher at the NFL level. And Shanahan, the quarterbacks, and even Morris himself have all alluded to him having a bigger role catching passes in the offense this year. So I think with all those things combined, he's going to be just fine. And I think that's kind of what shies people away from him, as they say, well, he's not a PPR back. Well, he ran for enough yards and got enough touchdowns that his lack of receptions didn't really hurt a whole lot last year. Absolutely. He was consistent, too, which is, I put him in my lineup. I started him every week that he was available. I got laughed at last year in one of these type of shows because I said you should be looking at Alfred Morris. I live in the area, so I'm paying attention to what's going on, and people are like, oh, come on, it's Halou and Evan Royster. And I drafted him in the 16th round or, things like this because, I thought, well, why not? I didn't believe that he wouldn't have a role. And so if people drafted Halou in the 5th round and you get, Alf off of the waiver wire or as a late pick, you're in pretty good shape. Yeah, definitely. I could not agree more. So I think, Allie, that is all we have for you today. I wanted to say thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to take a second to tell everyone where they can find you on Twitter, find your work on the internet and everything like that? Yes, I'm on Twitter all the time, day and night. I rarely sleep, and that's at Allie Fontana. I also will be writing this season for the FantasyFix.com. I have my own blog, FantasyFootballConfidential.com, and I have a weekly spot on
Friday mornings at 8 a.m. on Rags and the Bartender's Morning Show on 95.7 The Fan, and that's in South Bend.
Awesome. Everyone make sure to check out her work. Check her out on Twitter. I can tell you all she is up very late. She's one of like the 10 of us that are on there every night talking fantasy football. So check her out. And thank you so much again, Allie. You're such a great guest, and I'm sure we'll have you on again during the season.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Brian. Have a good day.
Al.
Cigar fans, check out fifthdowncigar.com and enter the coupon code PFC to get 10% off your order. Lots of nice high-end cigars. That's fifthdowncigar.com. Enter the code PFC for 10% off your order.
And welcome back to Fantasy Forecast Central. I want to thank Scott King from Football Extra Points for coming on. I also want to thank Allie Fontana from Fantasy Football Confidential for stopping by. Nick, that was one hell of a show we had today, man. Nick, turn on your goddamn...
This has been a presentation of the Pro Football Central Network. For news, blogs, highlights, and more, log on to ProFootballCentral.com.